He once slept with his wife's therapist. Now that same therapist is treating his new wife. And this time, she didn't come to heal. She came to end it. Want to know what really happened? Let's listen. Nina Rose once thought she was one of the lucky ones. She had a warm home in the suburbs of Seattle, a successful husband, and a baby growing inside her. But the one thing she never expected was how everything would collapse, suddenly, without warning. It was a rainy February morning. Nina woke up with a strange feeling in her body, empty, cold, and impossible to put into words. Her husband, Jack Hill, was still glued to his phone, typing emails without looking up, even as she stumbled into the bathroom. And when the blood poured out from between her legs, the only sound she heard was the tapping of his keyboard. She miscarried at 12 weeks. No clear reason, no solid explanation. It just happens, the doctor said. But for Nina, that just happens left a permanent fracture in her chest. Everything changed after that. Nina went quiet. The paintings she once loved came down from the walls. The light in her eyes faded. She stopped writing in her journal, stopped listening to music, stopped noticing the smell of coffee in the morning. And Jack? He said he needed to focus more on work. The company was expanding. New clients needed him on site. His schedule was packed. His phone always rang. "I'm sorry, let's talk tomorrow," became the standard line every night. What Nina needed wasn't a man with reasons. She needed someone to sit down, say nothing, and just let her lean in. But Jack was never the kind of man who knew how to do that. A week later, Nina's best friend Lauren came by to visit. She looked at Nina, messy hair, dark circles under her eyes, still wearing the same pajamas for 3 days, and said nothing for the first 10 minutes. Then, she quietly placed a business card on the table. Dr. Evelyn Walsh, psychotherapist, empathy and reality-based therapy. Lauren said only one thing. "She helped me after my mom passed. You don't have to do this alone." Nina didn't respond. But the next morning, she picked up the card and dialed the number. Evelyn's office was on the 8th floor of a quiet office building, with warm yellow lighting and the soft scent of lavender oil in the air. She wasn't the kind of therapist Nina had pictured. No white coat, no clipboard. She wore an earth-toned sweater, round glasses, and spoke in a voice that was low, steady, and strangely calming. "Hi, Nina," Evelyn said. "I'm not here to fix anything. I'm just here to sit with you, if you'll let me." For the first time in weeks, Nina cried. No screaming, no sobbing, just quiet tears spilling down her face, like someone had finally unlocked a valve deep in her chest. Week by week, she began to talk more about the fear of losing her child, about the empty space on the bed every night, about Jack's eyes lately, colder, more distant, like he wasn't even in the same room with her, even when they were sitting face to face. Evelyn listened. She nodded gently, asked short questions that somehow hit exactly where it hurt most. One day, Nina looked up and asked, "Have you ever loved someone you couldn't save from their own pain?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She just looked at Nina, a long, deep look. Something shifted in her eyes, a silent kind of empathy. Then one day, Jack decided to join Nina for a therapy session. "I think maybe it'd be good for us to go together," he said, eyes still locked on his phone screen. When they walked into the room, Evelyn stood to greet him. "Jack Hill," he introduced himself. "Nice to meet you." "Evelyn Walsh," she replied, without a smile. The moment their hands touched, Nina felt something in the room change. It wasn't obvious, but her instincts, sharpened by pain, caught it. A glance that lasted a heartbeat too long. She told herself, "I'm just being paranoid. I'm hurt. That's all this is." But instincts are rarely wrong, especially when they come from someone who's been hurt enough to stop trusting anyone. That day, Nina left with a blurry feeling, like her mind was trying to remember something her body wanted to forget. The handshake between Evelyn and Jack hadn't lasted long, but the look, that look, kept echoing in her head. Still, she pushed it aside, telling herself she was overthinking. Jack still went to work every day, still slept beside her every night. And Evelyn, she was still the only one who made Nina feel like she wasn't completely falling apart. 2 days after that first joint session, Jack told her he wanted to see Evelyn alone. "I just want to understand more about what you're going through," he said. "I don't want to keep standing on the outside." Nina felt relieved. At least he was trying. What she didn't know was that this was the first step Jack took into Evelyn's world. The first session between Jack and Evelyn was a short one, scheduled before her official hours. He arrived 15 minutes early, holding a coffee cup from the cafe Evelyn often mentioned during Nina's sessions. She froze for a second when she saw him. "Black coffee, no sugar, just how you like it," Jack said, lifting the cup. Evelyn gave a tight smile. "You didn't have to do that." "I didn't have to. I wanted to." At first, Evelyn kept her distance, chairs set far apart, questions kept neutral. But Jack wasn't like other patients or the usual spouses who tagged along. He spoke about Nina with words that sounded compassionate, but somehow detached. Like Nina was someone he used to know, not someone he still called his wife. "She's not herself anymore," Jack said, his voice soft but steady. "I can see the woman I love slipping away, and sometimes I wonder, am I to blame for not knowing how to hold on to her?" Evelyn looked at him, unsure how to respond. Most people who came to her carried some form of guilt, but Jack was different. He didn't beg for empathy. He made people want to give it to him. The sessions became regular, not just outside of hours, but outside of reason. Jack talked about work stress, about feeling alone inside his own marriage. He never directly criticized Nina, but by painting himself as the one trying, the one holding on, he made every disconnect feel justified. Evelyn started waiting for his messages. Messages that had nothing to do with Nina. Just "beautiful morning today." Or "I dreamed I was sitting in your office, but not for therapy." Messages that made her smile and then sit in silence for a long time after. By the time she realized she was hoping for something she shouldn't, it was already too late. One day Jack showed up at her door, soaked from the rain. No appointment. He just said, "I didn't know where else to go." Evelyn opened the door, and that was the first time they kissed. The affair didn't start with a confession. It started with the silence that followed that kiss. Neither of them said a word, but neither of them stepped back. Jack kept it quiet. Evelyn kept it quieter. They met at small hotels far from the city center. Time felt stolen from reality, and every time they parted, they said, "This is the last time." Then they'd meet again. Meanwhile, Nina continued therapy. She was slowly getting better. She laughed more, talked more, but deep inside, something still felt off. A sense that she was being lied to, but with no proof. One evening, while cleaning up the computer to send photos to Lauren, Nina opened the shared email inbox she and Jack used for managing household expenses. She wasn't looking for anything, just checking to see if there were any billing notices. One email stood out in the reservation confirmations folder. Recipient, Jack Hill, sent from a luxury hotel chain in Tacoma. Note, suite for 2. Booked 2 days in advance, private service package. The date, the same day Jack said he had to meet clients out of town. Nina didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just sat there, staring at the screen, hands still on the mouse, eyes locked and unblinking. Every line of that email turned into a blade, not cutting her skin, but slicing through the last bit of trust she had left. She printed the email, folded it into quarters, placed it in the nightstand drawer. Then she stood up and made herself a cup of tea. Her hands didn't shake, but the tears came anyway, quiet, steady, unstoppable. Nina finished the tea, no sugar, no milk. She sat still in the chair, the empty cup resting in her cold palms. The computer screen had gone dark, but the hotel confirmation lines burned into her memory like a stain that would never fade. That night, she didn't ask Jack a single thing. When he came home, she was in the kitchen, making dinner like she always did. She didn't check his phone. She didn't speak in a different tone. She looked at him once, long and steady, and he looked away. That was the last sign she needed. The next morning when Jack woke up, Nina was gone. The closet was half empty. Her perfume was gone from the dresser. The wedding ring sat alone in the small wooden tray by the bed. Next to it was a folded note, thin handwriting, sharp and final. "You need someone to heal your wounds, not someone who's wounded because of you." No sign-off, no name. But Jack knew that was the end. He called, no answer. He drove to her parents' house. The lights were off, no car in the driveway. He texted Lauren, only to get one reply. "She doesn't want to be found. It's best if you don't try." Jack wasn't used to being left. He was the one who controlled, who led, who always left first, before anyone could hurt him. But this time, Nina beat him to it. Evelyn found out through a message from Jack. Just 5 words, "She's gone. That's it." She sat in front of her phone for a long time, not responding. An emptiness rose from her stomach to her throat like a slow wave. She should have felt relief, but instead, a quiet panic settled in. Like standing on the edge of a cliff, just waiting for the wind to push her over. 3 weeks later, Evelyn received a letter from the Washington State Ethics Board. There had been an anonymous complaint accusing her of violating professional boundaries, engaging in a personal relationship with someone directly connected to a current patient. There was no hard evidence, but the complaint was detailed, too detailed to ignore. A formal investigation was opened. Evelyn said nothing. She didn't fight back. She didn't call Jack. She didn't reach out to Nina. At the hearings, she sat with her back straight, answering every question precisely. But she never tried to defend herself. Some lines, once crossed, can't be talked away. Her license was suspended for 6 months. She packed up her office in 2 days, took down each painting from the wall, each rug from the floor. The wooden clock, gifted by her very first patient, was carefully wrapped and placed in a box. On the bookshelf, The Ethics of Care in Modern Practice still sat, its last page dog-eared. She didn't open it. Jack showed up late in the afternoon on the second day. He didn't knock. He just stood in the hallway, watching as she sealed the last cardboard box. "You don't have to leave," he said quietly. "This will pass." Evelyn didn't turn around. "You always say that when someone else is paying the price." Jack stayed silent. 1 minute passed, then 2. Finally, he stepped into the room. "So, what about us?" he asked. "What happens now?" Evelyn looked up at him. Her face showed no anger, no heartbreak, just exhaustion. The kind that comes from realizing there's nothing left to defend and nothing left to hope for. "Jack, if you're asking whether I'm going to stay with you, the answer is no." He frowned. "Because of Nina?" She shook her head. "Because of me." Between them was a silence that stretched out long and flat. No tears, no begging, just 2 people standing in an empty room, once full of secrets, now with nothing left to hide. Jack left without another word. Evelyn closed the door behind him, turned the lock, as if sealing off a piece of herself. That night, she turned on every light in the living room, played old jazz records, and sat alone on the cold wooden floor. No one called. No one texted. And strangely, she was grateful for that. She'd survived deeper pain before. But this time, she swore, she would never again let herself become the tool someone uses to justify loving through someone else's wounds. 2 years later, Evelyn had reopened her practice in another state. Jack was still in Seattle, living a life that, from the outside, looked stable enough. No one mentioned Nina anymore, and the name Evelyn Walsh had quietly faded from the social circles Jack moved through. He knew how to make people forget what shouldn't be remembered, including himself. He met Rachel Sanders on a late fall afternoon at a gallery showing by a young photographer. She was standing alone, staring at a black and white photo of a woman's hand resting on a car window. The light in the image reflected across her face in a strange way, half in shadow, half in glow, like she was part of the photo herself. Jack stepped beside her and said something cliché. "She looks like she's leaving, but doesn't really want to." Rachel turned to him and smiled. "Or maybe," she said, "she's just taking one last look to make sure she never goes back." Jack stayed silent for a beat, long enough for Rachel to catch the flicker of surprise in his eyes, and just long enough for him to realize she wasn't like the women before. Rachel wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. She moved slowly through life, wrote in handwritten journals, shot photos with an old film camera, and hated small talk. She worked freelance, sold prints online, and occasionally taught photography at local community workshops. Jack was drawn to that quiet. With Rachel, he didn't have to explain much. She understood his silences, his looks, the things he left unsaid. In those early months, she made him feel lighter, like the weight of his past mistakes didn't cling to him so tightly anymore. They moved in together after 4 months. A year later, they had a small backyard wedding at a friend's house. No bridesmaids, no big reception, just a few close guests and glasses of wine that never made it to empty. Rachel brought new things into Jack's old home. The scent of cedarwood, her own photographs framed on every wall, a black cat named Bean, and mornings with no alarms, only soft music drifting from the kitchen. At first, everything felt calm, peaceful even. But then, night by night, Rachel started losing sleep. She couldn't explain why. Her body was tired, but her mind felt like it was being pulled somewhere else. She'd lie next to Jack, listening to his breathing, and feel distant. Some nights she'd wake at 3 a.m., sit for hours in her workspace, just staring at old photos, not editing, not sorting, just looking. She started losing interest in photography. Every recent shot she took was deleted before it could be saved. Friends invited her out for coffee. She declined. Everything around her seemed to lose its color. Rachel wasn't sure what was happening. She just felt like she was slowly disappearing, not in a dramatic or painful way, just quietly, bit by bit. She tried telling Jack. "I'm not okay," she admitted one rainy evening as they sat on the couch, soft amber light casting shadows on the ceiling. Jack set his wine glass down and looked at her for a moment. "You're overthinking," he said, his voice soft like he was calming a child. "No, really, I feel like I'm not myself anymore. You're just tired. Do less, sleep more. It's not about work." "Then what is it?" Jack asked, eyes still fixed on the TV, playing a movie he wasn't actually watching. Rachel went quiet. She knew if she tried to explain, he'd do what he always did, turn her worry into something small, something logical, something not worth being upset about. A week later, she started writing in her journal again, not to remember anything, but to see if the words could pull her back to herself. On one page she wrote, "I don't know where I'm drifting, but I know one thing for sure. I don't want anyone else steering this boat anymore." She decided to do something she once advised a friend to do, but had never done for herself: find a therapist. Not because she was losing control, but because something inside her was quietly being erased, little by little, and she wanted it back. Rachel set her pen down after finishing the last page of her journal. In the past week, she had written nearly 40 pages, all full of vague feelings she couldn't bring herself to share with Jack. Something was being drained from her. And if she didn't do something to reclaim it, she knew she'd lose something far more important than work or happiness: herself. The next morning, Rachel visited a private therapy center tucked inside a quiet neighborhood on the north side of the city. She had chosen it after hours of reading reviews, researching therapist credentials, and finally stopping on one name that wasn't flashy, but had a description that made her pause. "We don't promise to change you. We're just here when you begin to find yourself." She filled out the intake form and made one request clear: female therapist, preferably someone experienced in working with patients dealing with identity issues and emotional erosion within relationships. On a Thursday morning, exactly at 10 a.m., she arrived at the clinic as scheduled. The room was small and tidy, with cream-colored walls and warm, gentle lighting. No music, no scent of oils, just a kind of refined stillness. Then the office door opened. "Rachel Sanders?" A low, clear female voice called out. Rachel stood up and turned, meeting a woman in her 40s with neatly tied brown hair, round glasses, and a dark linen outfit. The face didn't ring any bells. She smiled softly and nodded. "Hello, I'm Dr. Evelyn Walsh." Rachel had no idea that this name, 2 years ago, was the reason a marriage had shattered. And Evelyn didn't recognize her at first either. Not until she glanced at the intake form and saw the name of Rachel's husband, Jack Hill. That name hit like a live wire down her spine. For a few seconds, the air in the room seemed to thicken. Evelyn looked at Rachel more closely. Soft curls, a quiet voice, and the way her deep eyes avoided direct contact when speaking about personal things. There was something about her that echoed Nina. Not in appearance, but in the way she shrank inward, in the quiet weight of someone being slowly consumed by something unnamed. Evelyn set the file down, took a deep breath, but didn't let it show on her face. "Please make yourself comfortable," she said gently. "I'll listen to anything you want to share today." Rachel sat down, hands clasped tightly together. She didn't know that the woman across from her had once crossed the very line Rachel was now desperately trying to avoid. Evelyn, on the other hand, knew everything, and yet kept her expression calm, as if none of it had ever happened. The first session unfolded like any other. Rachel spoke about the sleepless nights, the feeling of dissolving into the walls of the house she lived in, into the man she loved. She didn't accuse Jack of anything, because in truth, he hadn't done anything. But it was the not doing that made her feel invisible, like she no longer existed in his eyes. Evelyn offered no judgments. She asked a few open-ended questions, just enough to help Rachel move toward the things she wasn't yet ready to say aloud. Not once did Evelyn mention Jack by name. Not one question steered directly toward their relationship. But inside, something else was building. The familiar gnawing sensation of someone who had seen this man's patterns before, who knew exactly how far he could pull a woman into the kind of quiet collapse Rachel was now describing. After Rachel left, Evelyn stayed in the room for another 20 minutes. She opened the file and stared again at the name, Rachel Sanders Hill. She didn't know what Rachel knew, but she knew one thing for sure: this couldn't be just coincidence. During the second session, Rachel opened up more. She spoke about how she once saw herself as sharp, confident, capable, and how those parts of her had faded slowly after each quiet phrase from Jack. "You're overreacting. No one else thinks like that. You just need to rest." Evelyn wrote in her notebook, "Pattern of passive control, classic soft manipulation." By the third session, Rachel talked about almost leaving, not because Jack had someone else, but because she couldn't recognize the woman in the mirror anymore. Evelyn looked up. Her eyes were gentle. But inside, the tide had started to shift. Something deep was moving. At the end of each session, Evelyn stuck to the rules. No revelations, no steering, no reactions. But every night, once she was home, she opened an old notebook, the one where she'd recorded Nina Rose's final sessions. Each line, each detail, each moment of panic or fear began to mirror what Rachel was now describing. She knew this couldn't be treated like a typical case. This wasn't just therapy anymore. But she also knew, if she wanted to help Rachel, she couldn't make the same mistake again. No shortcuts, no blurred lines, no confessions, just listening. Until Rachel either found the piece of herself she'd lost, or until Evelyn had to decide: speak the truth or stay silent and watch another woman disappear into the dark. The fourth session began in silence. Rachel walked in, offered no small talk, no comments about the weather, no search for a casual opening. She simply sat down, pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket, and placed it on the table in front of her. "This is the message he sent me last week," she said, eyes fixed on the floor. "When I told him I might not come home that night." Evelyn unfolded the note. The message was short, cold, like a punch thrown without muscle. "Up to you. But don't expect me to come chasing." Evelyn folded the paper again, set it down, and picked up her pen. She said nothing. But her spine sat straighter, and her hand gripped the pen tighter than usual. She remembered a sentence, nearly identical, once scrawled in Nina's file almost 3 years ago. "She keeps turning everything into a tragedy. I don't have the energy to play the comforter anymore." In the sessions that followed, Rachel shared more. The details weren't shocking on their own, but strung together, they formed a pattern so precise it was almost chilling. She spoke about how Jack used silence as punishment, how every argument ended with her believing she was the one in the wrong, how he could shift from tenderness to coldness without warning, like a switch was snapped off inside him. "He doesn't yell. He doesn't insult," Rachel said one rainy afternoon, her voice barely a whisper. "But there's always something wrong in the way he looks at me. Like I'm a painting he used to like, but now keeps on the wall because he already bought it." Evelyn didn't react. She just wrote. She wrote more than in any previous session. Pencil in hand, underlining, timestamping, annotating. At times her hand froze mid-sentence, as if her brain needed a few more seconds to process what she'd just heard. Each time Rachel repeated something Jack had said, Evelyn felt like she was listening to an old recording. But this time, the audio was crystal clear, uncomfortably sharp. "I told him I felt lost," Rachel said. He replied, "That's because you keep trying to complicate simple things." Evelyn's mind instantly replayed a line from Nina. "He said I overthink, that I make myself miserable. But if that's true, why didn't I hurt like this before I met him?" And that's when Evelyn began to see it. Not just a pattern of behavior, but a cycle. And this time, it didn't just involve a new victim. It involved her too. She wondered, if she hadn't stayed silent 3 years ago, would Rachel still be sitting here now? But at the same time, Evelyn knew she couldn't step in as the savior. She wasn't allowed to. Not again. Each night after the clinic closed, she reopened Nina's old session notebook. Every underlined sentence, every red ink note in the margins. Every apology Nina wrote to herself for feeling guilty about being too sensitive. Evelyn read those pages, then looked over Rachel's new journal. 2 women, 2 timelines, 1 shared truth of pain, being dismissed by someone's gentle cruelty. Evelyn sat on her living room chair, a cup of cold tea beside her, rereading the pages over and over. She began to wonder, was Jack simply the product of an unnamed wound, or was he the one who created it? Then she brushed the thought aside. That wasn't the question that needed answering right now. All she knew was, Rachel was falling into the same pit Nina once had. And this time, Evelyn couldn't just watch. But how could she help without breaking the rules? How could she open a path without leading the way? How could she bring the truth into light when the one holding it was the same person who once buried it? The questions spun in her head, night after night. There were moments she wanted to call Nina, just to ask one thing. If I told the truth, would you forgive me? But she didn't call. Evelyn knew redemption doesn't come from words. It has to come from action. And this time, it couldn't be the wrong one. The next morning when Rachel arrived, Evelyn didn't ask anything. She simply opened her notebook, listened, and kept writing. But in her eyes, for the first time in years, there was something different. A quiet resolve, mixed with the same guilt that had never left since the day everything began. That day, Rachel spoke less than usual. She walked into the room, set down her bag, and sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. Evelyn didn't rush her. She just flipped to a fresh page, ready. I dreamed I was trapped in a dark room, Rachel said, her voice low. No door, no one else, just me and a white wall. And I kept banging on it until my hands bled, but no one heard me. Evelyn made no reaction except to write one more line. But inside, a tight, breathless ache twisted in waves through her chest. That therapy session ended in a long silence, as if both women knew they had reached the final edge of something about to break. That evening, Evelyn sat in her small apartment, a cup of untouched tea beside her desk. She opened her laptop and began typing into a blank document. No emotion, no anger, no blame. Just the truth, raw and uncompromising. She wrote about a former patient named N, someone she had treated at her previous office. She described a relationship manipulated by a man with a subtle grip, invalidating emotions, minimizing anxiety, and making the victim question her own intuition. She didn't include any names, but the details were just enough for someone involved to recognize themselves. She added that the therapist in the story had lost her license, not for incompetence, but for crossing ethical lines. That the therapist herself had been hurt and in a moment of weakness became a tool in a cycle that damaged others. There are mistakes you live with forever, she typed as the final line. And sometimes the only way to make it right isn't to say sorry, but to stop someone else from repeating it. She printed the letter, folded it into thirds, and placed it inside a plain light brown envelope. No return address, no logo. Just one simple line written across the front. Rachel Sanders, personal, confidential. The next day, Evelyn left early. She mailed the letter from a post office nearly 10 kilometers away from her clinic, just in case Rachel ever tried to trace where it came from. 3 days later, the envelope landed in Rachel's hands. She received it in the late afternoon, right after a grocery run. No name, no return address, but something about it stopped her from tossing it aside. The envelope wasn't thick, but it felt heavy. Not from the number of pages, something else, something pulsing beneath the seal. She sat down at the kitchen table, opened it, and began to read. By the 3rd paragraph, her hands were trembling. The further she read, the faster her heart pounded. Every detail, every phrase, every behavioral pattern, every subtle manipulation mirrored exactly what she was living. Line by line, example by example, it became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a coincidence. She reread the part about silence being used as a tool to make the other person feel at fault. Then the section on never touching the body, but always finding the weak spot to break the trust. Then the line about loving someone not to walk beside them, but to make them try hard enough just to be allowed to stay. By the time she reached the final paragraph, she let the letter fall from her hands. It felt like something had been torn open inside her. If any of this feels familiar, know that it's not your fault. But if you stay silent, you will keep living a life that isn't your own. Rachel sat still for nearly an hour. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at the wall in front of her, as if it held a door that had always been there, but she had never seen it. She picked up her phone, opened her messages, and stared at the name Jack at the top of her contacts. But she didn't type a thing. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out the door. She walked straight to Jack's office, the place he always claimed to stay late to wrap up contracts. She had never shown up unannounced. But this time, she didn't need an appointment. The security guard downstairs recognized her. She smiled politely and took the elevator to the 16th floor. The office was quiet. Jack's door was slightly ajar, a dim streak of light spilling from within. She knocked twice, didn't wait for a response, pushed the door open. Jack looked up from behind his desk. "Hey, what's going on? Is everything okay?" Rachel didn't answer right away. She stared straight into his eyes, holding the folded letter in her hand like a loaded weapon. "Do you know who my therapist is?" she asked, voice steady. Not a hint of tremble. The air went still, so still it felt like every molecule had frozen, waiting for an answer. Jack looked at her, but this time, he couldn't read her. And for the first time, Rachel didn't need him to understand. She only needed him to listen. Jack didn't respond right away. Her question had dropped like a stone into the calm surface he'd been desperately trying to maintain. She stood there, still clutching the letter, eyes neither angry nor pleading, just silent. A sharp, cutting kind of silence that no apology could interrupt. He rose from his chair, took a step toward her. "Rachel, what is this?" She raised the letter slightly, then placed it on his desk. The LED light above hit the glass surface, and the words on the page glowed faintly, like they were still speaking. "You must have read something that isn't true," Jack continued, his voice low, like he was trying to pull her back into the same space of persuasion he'd used on so many others. Rachel didn't respond. She just stood there, eyes locked on his face. Not angry, not afraid, just the gaze of someone who already knows too much to need to ask. "Have you ever heard the name Evelyn Walsh?" she asked, her voice low but each word sharp and clear. This time, Jack's eyes flinched, just for a second. But it was enough. She nodded slightly, like confirming what she already knew. "She's the one treating me." She didn't say anything, didn't need to, because now everything's already been said in how you just reacted. Jack turned his face away slightly, taking a breath. "You don't understand what things were like back then. It's over now." "You're right," Rachel cut in. "It's over for you, but other people are still living in what you left behind." A heavy silence fell over the room. Only the soft hum of the air conditioner and the steady ticking of the wall clock filled the space. "You once cost a therapist her career," Rachel said, each word landing like a stone breaking through frozen water. "Now she's saving me, with the very wound you gave her." Jack opened his mouth as if to argue. But then he said nothing. His eyelids fluttered once, like he was trying to swallow something that couldn't be put into words. Rachel looked at him one last time. A long, deep look. No bitterness, no blame. Just the one thing Jack had never learned how to face, the kind of disappointment that only comes from complete understanding. She turned away without another word. Each of her footsteps echoed through the wide room like a knock on a final door, the door to a truth that had been held shut for far too long. Jack didn't follow, didn't call out, didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, as if still trying to redefine who he was now that the mask had come off. Rachel walked out of the building without looking back. The evening breeze stirred gently, carrying the scent of the day's fading sun and the dampness of rain-soaked ground. She didn't know exactly where she was headed. But one thing was certain. The place she had just left would never again be the place she returned to. The next morning, Evelyn sat in her therapy room, early sunlight filtering through the thin white curtains, casting long lines of light across the wooden floor. She was making tea, each motion slow and deliberate, like a quiet meditation. On her desk, Rachel's file lay open, but there were no more pencil marks, no more notes. Just one final sentence written in blue ink across the last page. "Silence doesn't protect anyone. Sometimes it's the final cut." She didn't know how many times Rachel had read that letter, didn't know what she had said, done, or would do next. But that morning, when Evelyn opened her email, there was a short message from an unnamed address. "Thank you. Not for saving me, but for not letting me drift away like the one before." Evelyn didn't reply. She simply sat there, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, eyes gazing out the window. Sometimes, justice doesn't come in the form of a verdict. It doesn't arrive with shouting or grand gestures. It comes when a woman holds on to the part of herself she nearly lost, when another refuses to let history repeat itself, and when those who once failed choose not to fail again. In the soft light of that morning, Evelyn tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing with quiet clarity. No victory, no defeat, no dramatic ending, just a quiet circle, finally closed. And sometimes, that's enough. Some people come into our lives not to love us, but to teach us how to save ourselves, especially when love becomes a kind of cage. Jack wasn't the villain in a movie. He was the type people admire. Kind, successful, always knowing the right thing to say. But it's exactly that kind of person, when they refuse to face their own darkness, who can cause others to lose themselves. Evelyn had made mistakes, but she chose not to let those mistakes be the reason she stayed silent forever. Rachel had lost her way, but she stepped out before she was completely consumed. Not everyone fights back with screams. Some goodbyes come in silence and echo louder than any words ever could. What would you do if you were Rachel? Would you have the courage to walk away, even when everything looks fine on the surface? Have you ever met someone like Jack? Someone who never does anything wrong, yet slowly makes you lose who you are. If this story speaks to you, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Thanks for listening. See you next time.